All right. Come on and grab that last cupcake, grab your seat. We're going to move into our final panel discussion of the afternoon. So we're going to be focusing on looking ahead. We've heard some amazing stories about the history of Che. We've heard about some of the challenges we face in communicating this science that is so important and affects all our lives in so many different ways. And we've talked about the importance of relationships and the people that are doing this work. So it's been a really lovely afternoon so far. So I want to invite Tyrone Hayes and Pete Myers up to the stage. And I'm going to introduce them as they're getting situated. So you've heard a lot about Pete over the course of the morning already. Pete is Chief Scientist and Board Chair of Environmental Health Sciences, Board Chair of the Science Communication Network. Pete founded EHS 2 decades ago. It's a national organization, as many of you know, that now houses several communications platforms and projects. He's also a board member and founder of SUDAC, who he might tell us a little bit more about that as part of his presentation. And then Tyrone Hayes is professor in the Department of Integrative Biology at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on the role of steroid hormones in amphibian development. He conducts both laboratory and field studies in the US and Africa. And I'd like you to read more about Tyrone and his research in your packet. I know that in the world that I spent a lot of time in for 25 years on pesticide issues, Tyrone is known as the frogman. He's done amazing research on atrazine, which Syngenta is not very happy about. So without further ado, I want to invite the two of you to share your reflections and thoughts on the field of environmental health sciences, and what we face right now, and what the challenges are that are ahead of us, and how we might overcome them. So welcome.
Thank you. Wow, what an amazing group of people present here and working with Che for 20 years. It's simply awesome to be able to think back about all that's happened, and also to think forward about what is going to happen. And I'd begin with 2 things that I hold dearly, sort of as theories of change, principles of change, challenges of change. One of those theories is epitomized by Che. It's the Ocean's 11 theory of change. If all those guys had been Brad Pitt, it would not have worked, right? You saw the movies. They needed different phenotypes, and that's one of the things that Che has done brilliantly, is bring together people with different skill sets, different knowledge, different interests, and forge them into working teams. How many have there been? I couldn't answer that Che numbers question, but there have been a lot, as you've heard today, and there have been more than you've heard about today. The second thing, after the Ocean's 11 theory of change, is what I might call the Kuhn principle. Thomas Kuhn. How many of you read Theories of Scientific Revolution? When you think about that, it helps understand why it's taking us so long, right? It isn't one scientific finding that accomplishes a structural change in science. It isn't 10. It's a drumbeat, one after the other, for decades, that changes deeply held scientific paradigms. And we've been under the iron grip of the Paracelsus paradigm for 500 years. No wonder it's taken us a long time. But then at the same time, I look at what's happened since Che was founded, since this movement was born 25 years ago. And I've seen significant change, and I see it accelerating. We are on an exponential curve of growth, and it's the only good exponential curve of growth I've ever heard of. Usually exponential growth is seriously bad stuff. But when you see the exponential growth in the people who are committed to delivering safer materials to people, to kids, to parents, you begin to understand, when you see the growth in that, you see hope. You see that a lot is possible And I see it as accelerating. I just came back Thursday night from a couple days in Brussels. So if I stumble, it's jet lag. I'll blame jet lag. But I've been working now for the last 13, 14 years, following the leadership of Michael Lerner in trying to establish beachheads for our science in Europe. And we are there. If I were to ask people in the European Parliament to hold up their hand if they heard the word and the phrase endocrine disruption, almost every member of Parliament would have their hand up. It's extraordinary what is changing in Europe right now. And Kristen asked me to be brief, so I will, because we want to have lots of opportunity for interchange. But if there's a single demonstration of the rate and direction of change right now in the European system, thanks to what's called the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability, which has now been written and completely embraces endocrine science, good endocrine science, and there are a lot of people we've been working on to make sure that happened. The single indicator that I always turn to is what EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, did in recalculating their estimated tolerable daily intake of bisphenol A, which in December of 2021, they said, we need to reduce the tolerable daily intake of BPA by a factor of 100,000. That will get, if that is approved, that will get all of BPA out of all food contact materials in Europe. And it will send ripples around the world. European strategy right now, European policies are changing very rapidly in directions we have collectively helped make happen. And that's the best news I can report to you about the future of chemical policy. I would say we have won in Europe, won the battle over non-monotonicity. EFSA endorses it. They recognize it as real. There's still some nuances that they haven't gotten right, but it's there, it's real, it's recognized. And how did that happen? Mostly it happened because reporters uncovered conflicts of interest in EFSA's board. It embarrassed EFSA and the European Council, and they got rid of all the members that were conflicted. And boom, they lowered the tolerable daily intake by 100,000-fold, which takes it to 1 million-fold beneath what the FDA's current level is. And now there are activists in this country going to the FDA and saying, what does EFSA know that you don't? So there's some really interesting openings coming up in this country over BPA. And if we can, some people have criticized me for focusing on BPA as long as I have, and it's a long time. But it's been clear from the outset that the science on BPA was so strong that if we could achieve a breakthrough on that chemical, it changes everything. And I think in Europe we've done it. It is changing everything, and I think we can do it here in the United States if the people that are working on this today continue to push it as effectively as they are. So here's to all those people and the good that they can do. I'm going to stop there. I could say a lot more. It's a privilege to be up here with Tyrone, whom I've known for a long time. And so Tyrone, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pete. The trouble with going last, I can think of two problems. One is everything's already been said. And two, I'm the last thing between you and the wine and food. So I will be brief. Frog boy, huh? I've been called worse, I guess. The one thing I haven't heard anybody mention here today is frogs. So I'm going to start with that. I am, in fact, a little boy who likes frogs. I got involved in this because I've been in love with frogs and fascinated by frogs for as long as I can remember. And even before it was popularly known scientifically, I've wondered where are all the frogs going. So some of you may or know, and some of you may not, 80% of the world's amphibians are in decline. I got involved in research around this issue just as I was finishing graduate school. And I published a paper called The Cause of Amphibian Decline. And that was meant to be sarcastic, because there is an anthropogenic cause, but we've done more than just one thing to screw up the earth. And what I've learned is, as Shauna mentioned, I think you have to study animals to understand the impact of endocrine disrupting compounds. The things that I discovered, for example, that the herbicide atrazine demasculinizes and feminizes frogs, requires an intact developing frog to understand both that process, but also how these compounds interfere with that process. I also learned that you need controlled experiments where you examine the impact of one chemical on the endpoints that you're interested in. But I also very quickly learned that while these controlled experiments are necessary to understand the impacts, the effects, and the underlying mechanisms, it is inadequate for understanding the true impact on a population, on a species, or on a class, or on animals in general. Because as you've already heard, and as everybody here knows, you're not exposed to one chemical at a time. Not only that, if I'm thinking about frogs and why a frog's declining, I'm not gonna tell you that it's atrazine. I'm not gonna tell you that it's pesticides. But pesticides and environmental contaminants are an important part, but these animals are also being impacted by habitat loss. They're being impacted by climate change. They're being impacted by emergent diseases. And when you look at the combination, it becomes very, very complicated. And not only that, each generation responds in a different way because of genetics and selection, because of epigenetics, in the case of chemicals, because these chemicals are being passed down from mostly the maternal offspring to the next generation. And so you have to look at that all in that context to truly understand the impact. You have to look at it in that context and understand the impact on not just amphibians, which I would argue are probably a little more sensitive than other animals, but these same issues are of concern when we talk about public health and human health. I also learned in that process that there are, I'm gonna say individuals, they form corporations, but individuals take these actions that will go out of their way and do anything to get you going in the wrong direction. I started this work with funding from a company that, in documents that then appeared in court, a company that later spent tens of thousands of dollars, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars to, in their words, written in their own handwriting, to discredit Hayes. And so there's a counter voice out there trying to deny the truth, trying to remove people from the truth. More important than that, another thing that I haven't heard mentioned here today is that we've all just, and I'll tell you why I say more important in a minute, we've all just come through, or we all are participating still in our first pandemic. And what I saw, what I witnessed during the pandemic is people, whether they wanted to or not, witnessing science firsthand for the first time. Trying to assign it to people who didn't have an education necessarily in science, trying to understand and trying to differentiate between the origin of the virus, for example. Was it developed in a lab? Did it come from a pangolin? Did it come from a bat? Is it a bioweapon? To try and understand positive and negative controls, to trying to understand not only how vaccines work, but an mRNA vaccine. I heard things like, well, it's altering my genes, and they mixed it up with CRISPR, and it's gene editing, and I'm being chipped. And what I saw was that people, it seemed, were equally likely to believe that this was a bioweapon that was put out there, and now they were being microchipped with something that was going to alter their DNA. I had interactions with people who said things like, people who were against getting vaccines, people who said things like, Tyrone, you of all people should understand after what you've gone through that Big Pharma will lie, that Big Pharma will do anything to make money. And I found myself in this position of trying to explain to people that people with letters behind their names don't necessarily have all the answers and aren't necessarily providing accurate information. And so I think an even bigger challenge for us is, well, I don't think we should be asking what more can Che do for us, but what more can we do for Che? You already heard, when I first got involved in this 20 years ago, I was told things like, don't be an advocate, let the science speak for itself. Syngenta even used that. They would often publish Hayes turned activist. Activist was a bad word. Advocate was a bad word. Even my mentors, scientists, some of my mentors, scientists, people that I respected very much, said, don't be an advocate. Let the science speak for itself. Just present the science. But I think after we've seen even some members of my family express a distrust in scientists, or an ability to, a likelihood of trusting misinformation from, quote, other scientists, makes it even more difficult. So even bigger than the challenges of understanding how these individual chemicals come together to create mixtures effects and how those are impacted by other environmental effects like climate change and habitat loss, we've got to find out how to better get the information out in a way that the general public, that all citizens can understand it, especially populations that are more vulnerable. And so I'll stop there because, again, second, I'm between the food and the drinks, and I want to make sure that we get there.
I'll take a step to protect you, okay? Because Kristen asked me to say something about SUDOC, which I think is good news. A couple good things about it. SUDOC is a company that Terry Collins and I started 3 years ago. It takes Terry's chemistry and makes it into a commercial product. I'm on the board of a chemical company now. One of the first things I did after joining the effort was I gave all of my shares, to the horror of my son, to an irrevocable grantor trust, which means I cannot benefit personally, nor can he, from however successful the company is. And I offer this I talk about this with you because I think there's a new era headed towards us of how chemical companies behave. We're trying to set an example, but I've spent 15 years now working with chemists, trying to help them make money making safer materials. The truth about endocrine disruption is that we know so much more now about how that works, what causes it, that we can actually help chemists change their design criteria to avoid endocrine disruption in new materials. So now we've got the scientific knowledge of how to make the moves toward truly not regrettable substitutes, truly safe substitutes. We at SUDOC have hired some people, Tyrone being one of them. We hired four of the world's leading endocrine disruption specialists to make sure our solutions today don't become tomorrow's problems. Tyrone's been testing frogs. Laura Vandenberg has been testing mammals. We did some zebrafish testing. And our guarantee to him and to the other four, Fred Vumpsal, Tom Zeller, Laura, and Tyrone, is we'll give you the money to do the research, but you're in charge of it. We won't mess with it. You design the experiments, you execute them, you analyze them, and you publish them. Now, that's not exactly the way Syngenta treated you, is it?
It's a little bit.
So our goal with this is, first, the chemistry is astounding. It oxidizes bad stuff. It's going to help us get a lot of bad chemicals out of the environment, especially out of drinking water and sewage water. It's also going to require a lot less chemical to operate. But I think the most important thing we're doing is we're setting an example of how chemical companies ought to behave. And we're going to make money at it. Not me, but the chemistry of Terry's chemistry is going to, we think, massively disrupt at least a dozen multi-billion-dollar industries. So it's big, and it's going to be here to help us. We're going to use whatever profits go into the trust to fund work in environmental health and sustainable chemistry. We think that's what all chemical companies should do, and almost none of them do it really, unless they try and mistreat people like Tyrone, as they often do. So is that enough?
I want to know what Tyrone did to Syngenta.
What did I do to them?
What did you do to them?
I just published some data.
You had some help, right?
In fact, I had a lot of help. I had a lot of support from Pete and others at a time when the university, oh, that's a long story. When the university was not only not helpful, were actually disruptive under pressure from Syngenta. And there was at least, I mean, there was a lot more than that, but there was at least one point where Pete organized a letter of support from scientists, chairs, and deans from around the world that for the first time, the university lawyer stepped up and wrote a letter back to Syngenta and asked him to stop harassing me. I mean, they didn't, but.
Make polluters pay.
That's part of the European principle. I'm really proud to say that when I was at the W. Alton Jones Foundation and Syngenta told him he couldn't publish his results, along with Marisol Foundation, we organized funding to allow him to repeat the experiments.
That too, yeah.
Great, so we are gonna open up for questions, both in the room and on Zoom. And we have about 15 minutes or so, a little bit more. And by the way, Tyrone, I'm the one between everybody and the reception. I have a little spiel to do, so you're off the hook. And I'm gonna talk really fast.
I was thinking about me getting to,
But, and I would pause it before we dive in for questions that I think Shauna Swan called out the need for communicating science in ways that people can really understand it and understand how important these issues are that are facing us right now. And I would posit that we have on this stage two of the best science communicators I've ever been, in honored to work with at all. So I really appreciate you having you in this room and all the work that you do. So thank you. So, and Susan Greylock-Gissam is going to help with passing the mic. So raise your hand. And it looks like Allie has a question, Susan.
So Shauna brought up a really important issue, which is it made me think about this new trend to get off animal studies and use machine learning, which I got pitched a proposal at Forsythia to fund machine learning and quickly was disabused about that. And I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the downsides of relying on AI and machine learning to understand toxicity and endpoints, because it was really scary.
That scares me too, because there are too many people infatuated with the success of machine learning at solving simple problems, not realizing, at least from my point of view, the complexity of the endocrine system and how it does not lead to any easy approach. Machine learning can be part of it, but ultimately, as he said, you've got to test in whole animals. We've got too many examples where you would not have seen the effect of the effect unless you were working with a whole animal. Most recently, some of you may have seen last week, there was a report published on metformin, which is the world's biggest drug on treating diabetes, and how it causes reproductive harm. And it is an endocrine disruptor, but not through normal endocrine disrupting channels. The mechanism is not yet known. This would not have been seen with animal testing. It could not have been modeled with AI, because the data you need to feed the AI stuff, those data aren't there. We cannot give up animal testing. Now, we can dramatically reduce how many animals are tested. And if I get faced with an argument about that, I say, wait a second. If we obliterate animal testing, depend only upon in vitro assays, AI, et cetera, we are condemning billions of organisms on the planet to those things we didn't detect. That's many more animals than have ever been used in all of the history of animal testing. We just can't subject biodiversity to those harms.
Because of the false negative.
Yeah.
Tyrone, any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I agree. I think when you, for example, when you look at atrazine, for example, has no direct effect on the larynx or the voice box in frogs. Atrazine affects the hormones that come from the testis, which then prevent the larynx from growing properly. There's no way you could separate those two organs and treat with atrazine and get that kind of effect, because it's not a direct effect. And that's especially true when we're talking about hormones, because of course, as everybody here knows, there are chemicals that are secreted from one organ and that circulate all over the body. And their job may be to stimulate a hormone from yet another organ that then circulates and may affect another organ. And there's no way right now that AI and machine learning can detect that. And there's no way you can do that kind of work in vitro and find those effects. Maybe someday, but we're nowhere near there now.
Other questions? Thoughts?
I'll add too, there's no way you're going to see the effects across generations as well, because the next bit of work that we have coming out is showing that each generation responds differently depending on their history of exposure.
And to pick up on that, probably the biggest regulatory challenge related to endocrine disruption is how do we deal with transgenerational epigenetic inheritance when some of the time you don't see an effect in the first generation, in the fetus. You only see it in subsequent generations. No regulatory testing today has even begun to look at that.
Mike Skinner was a Che partner, the guy who published on transgenerational inheritability.
We all should learn to chant transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And we need, who was the sixth? Never mind.
Well, I have a question for both of you. Tyrone, you talked about how there are multiple factors right now that are stressors on frogs. It's not just chemicals, it's climate, it's other things as well. And I'm wondering if each of you could talk a little bit about that intersection of petrochemicals particularly and climate, and in terms of how that looks going forward, what as an environmental health movement, how we should be thinking about addressing the fact that plastics and pesticides are being produced that also drive climate change, and that the health effects of those are exacerbated by climate change, like that interactive and kind of multiplying effect.
There's several answers to that, I think. Do you want me to?
You can start. It makes my head spin. Yeah. And again, another one of those things that you can't model with AI, but
yeah. On one intersection between those two is quite simple to understand, and it's that there are millions of tons of toxins, toxic compounds that have captured those chemicals over the last 30 or last 50 years of their production in glacial ice and snow. And now we are reliberating them. And people are reporting rising amounts of DDT, for example, in Swiss lakes, and a whole series of effects along those lines. A second is that if you look at the production of plastics that then lead to endocrine disruption and other health effects, you begin to understand also that the production of them leads to dramatic increases in carbon emissions. So you've got, on the one hand, you have production of nasty chemicals contributing to climate change, and then you've got climate change contributing to the reliberation of those chemicals. But Margaret Atwood, you know what she had to say about this? She said, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. And nothing truer than that has been said.
I think someone named Michael Lerner calls it a polycrisis.
Yeah.
So, Tyrone, any thoughts?
I guess I'd like to say to the people who aren't little boys and little girls who love frogs, is one of the ways that we started to look at this interaction very early on was overcrowding in tadpoles. So when you get overcrowding in tadpoles, you get an increase in what we call the stress hormone corticosterone. That in and of itself has negative impacts on growth, development, and immune function. So now imagine the habitat loss causing tadpoles to become more and more crowded, which increases their stress hormone levels, which decreases their immune function. Now you bring in a new disease or pathogen, which otherwise may not have had such a big impact. But now you have animals that are immunocompromised. Imagine now, because of habitat loss and the drought that we experience in California, the pesticides in the water are increasing at much higher concentrations. And also the temperatures increasing in those areas. So now you have multiple stressors, not one of which may not have had that big of an impact. But when you combine all of them, you get a huge impact. Now, if you're not a little boy or girl who loves frogs, I don't know how many of you know Nadine Burke Harris. She was the first Surgeon General in California. Her whole way that she got involved in public health was looking at children in Bayview Hunters Point, primarily low-income people of color, overcrowding and their increased susceptibility to disease. And you can read her book, so I'm not just taking credit for somebody else's success. She got that idea because she worked in my lab as an undergraduate, and she took that whole concept, this interaction between, climate and density and stress and disease having an impact, and that's what she was known for in her work before she was California's first state Surgeon General. So even if you don't care about, if you're not a little boy or girl who cares about frogs, these are concepts that we can apply across animals, including Homo sapiens ourselves.
I can tell a very personal dimension to this. How many of you know his sister, Shori? In 2018, her home in Montclair, California, was overwhelmed by smoke from the campfire, as was all of the Bay Area. And a few months later, she gave birth early because of preeclampsia. 2 months. And my granddaughter spent 2 months in the NICU. Well, as soon as I heard that my daughter had had a cesarean section because of preeclampsia, I looked up, are there any data on smoke and preterm birth? And within 15 minutes, I found Tracy's work. Why is that relevant to what you just asked? Well, the houses that burned in the campfire were full of plastics. We know that the smoke that swirled around the Bay Area was full of the results of burning plastic, in addition to soot, et cetera, et cetera. And I found other papers that were specifically about preeclampsia and bisphenol A and phthalates. So I take that very personally. But it's a conundrum because 2 months in the NICU saved her life, and the NICU is full of plastics. So we've got this something that's hard to hold, caused a severe health effect, saved by the same materials that may have been involved in producing the severe effect, and we've got to work that out. And I respond to that by saying we need to redesign the plastics so that they don't contain some of the materials that contribute to that. We've got to reform the regulations so that we get beyond the Paracelsus era, and we have to rethink, why do we need plastics in the first place? There are essential uses of plastics, and that's where the chemists should concentrate on finding replacements that are inherently safer. But we can eliminate a lot of uses of plastic right now by rethinking.
I just want you to say a little bit, I want you to say a little bit more about plastic, the phthalates that Sierra was exposed to in the NICU.
Well, one of the most common plastics in the NICU is in PVC plastic and related ones used. Phthalates are in all sorts of medical equipment. I'm jet lagged right now. In IV bags and IV tubing, et cetera.
Right, and particularly in the nasal cannula that she was breathing through, was conveying measurable amounts of phthalates and other chemicals, and they don't have to be there. They're not required for her survival.
Well, I agree with you. And we've got to convince the people who make that equipment that they've got safer alternatives, and we've got to convince the doctors and the nurses who use them. There is a company, Environmental Health Sciences is working with them right now, a multi-billion-dollar privately held German company that makes medical equipment. They came to us and they said, how can we make safer plastic? And we are working with them, helping them develop an inventory of what's in which pieces of plastic that are going to hospitals, and trying to help them figure out, are there replacements? And if so, And if not, how can we design them to be safer? It's a road that we thought was solved years ago by some really great campaigning by people trying to eliminate phthalates from plastic in hospital equipment. But they didn't close the deal because it turns out that two things are wrong with the current replacements for phthalates, or replacement plastics to remove phthalates. One is that it turns out that the currently available replacement plastic, when a nurse uses this in a hurry, she'll take the bag and slap it over her shoulder and run off to the next room. They break. They break if it's one of the currently available plastics. And the other is what is likely to be a myth, according to Terry Collins. The myth is that phthalates prolong the viability of blood. And Terry says that's probably not true, and we're involved with some people right now trying to test if that specific hypothesis is true. That'll make the replacements, it'll remove at least one of the impediments to the replacements. But more importantly, we have a billion-dollar company, multi-billion-dollar company committing at least $1 billion to finding replacements.
Awesome. So I have one final question for you all, which as we wrap up, do you have any final words of inspiration, wisdom, motivation that you want to leave with the room? No pressure.
I would return to what I opened with. It takes a long time to achieve the amount of change that we need, but we're well on the pathway to getting there. If we stand together in that Ocean's 11 team and keep moving, keep communicating, keep the work going. So thank you all for contributing to that.
Yeah, and I would just say I'm honored to have been a part of today and remain hopeful that together we'll make things happen.
Thanks so much to you both.